My name's Glyn Pooley, and I'd like to talk about art. This time, my subject is...
So we're looking at Hilma af Klint and Agnes Pelton. Sort of tying these two artists together. First artist is a Swedish artist, and the second artist was born in Stuttgart, in Germany, but in her early life moved over to America. Okay, but we'll see that there's sort of influence and similarities between their work. There's a picture of Hilma in 1895. It's interesting, there was a very large retrospective of her work. I think some of you went last year in London at the Tate Modern. The kind of work that she produced, is sort of got reignited around these last few years. It's work that was, as you can see from the date, 1895, a period of exploration into the spiritual world, really. And it opens up a completely different dimension. We're also looking at two female artists today. Hilma af Klint's work, the main body of her work, was not seen until after her life for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss. But their relevance has seemed to got stronger and stronger. So let's go back to where it started for her, with a quite precise education in terms of she went to the Royal Academy in Sweden, and they taught her to paint traditionally, and mainly portraits and landscapes. And this was something which she did all through her life, as well as botanical studies, illustrative kind of ways of painting, but precise observation of the material world. This connection with the botanical and a deep looking at nature then overflows into a abstract world. She's seen as an artist that engaged with the abstract nature of creating art. She was a foremost artist. She was creating abstract works that predated people like Kandinsky and Mondrian and people like Malevich, who, are known for abstract art. She came to it from a different perspective. But even in this botanical study, you can see here, there's indications of symbolism, which was a movement which was prevalent in the 1880s, 1890s, up until the turn of the 20th century. You can see there's a symbolism here of obvious male flower and female flower linking. This was something that she explored quite deeply. She was interested in the movement towards, you could say, they mentioned spiritualism, but the occult as well, and looked around the world to all kinds of world religions. I thought I'd put these two in because it shows her academic training, and something which, you can see she's a sensitive painter of naturalistic scenes. They've got a deep sense of place, but they also got a delicacy to them, which kind of picks up the nuance of the light. And this again, a symbol of light and specific light, takes on another dimension from the physical light you're seeing here to this notion of a spiritual light that she develops in her abstract works. Nice to see this sort of combination, if you like, in artists. When we're looking at work which just becomes primarily abstract, because it's interesting to see how they look at the material world and then translate that into the abstract world. So we're seeing a sensitive, nuanced artist here who moved into this perception of the other world at a time in her life when she was a late teenager, when her sister passed on. And she got interested in taking part in a movement called Theosophy. And Theosophy is a Western religion that was set up by primarily a lady called Madame Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky. And it was looking for a universal truth between all the world's religions. So she would have been exploring Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and a whole host of other religions, which would then kind of coalesce into a unified spiritual form. So she set up with a group of other ladies called the Five that were all interested in what we could say spiritual or transcendental art. And they would hold these meetings where they would say prayers, they'd have reflections, they would study these world religions, and then it'd be followed by a séance. I don't know if any of you have been to séances. Personally, I haven't, but I imagine they're quite moving experiences, particularly if something does move on that table or whatever. But it was a way for them to get in touch with another sense of reality, okay? A sense of the other world, literally. Now, one of the ways to step into it from art is the way we're seeing on the screen here. This is a representation of an automatic drawing. An automatic drawing is something where you just lay your paper down or your surface, of course, try and empty your mind of any predetermined idea of what you're going to create on that surface, and then be moved, literally be moved by your inner, in this case, your inner spirit. Now, this way of working was, you might remember, some of you might remember, was something which was quite predominant for the Surrealist movement. Now, they were many decades after this. So Hilma, Klint and the group, they were kind of forerunners in this process. And from these automatic drawings, because they've been in a sense of deep union and meditation with what they call their spirit guides that came to them via these seances, they would then adapt them and take in the information to put into their paintings to communicate deeper understandings of this world with the audience. And she developed between 1906 or 7 and 15 a series of very large paintings that were created for her under the influence of her spirit guide. She painted them almost like automatically, this is from her accounts, without any reservations of whether something was right or was wrong. It was just almost like a force had taken over her, and she put this information down. And when we look at through this presentation now, and we'll look at the scale of these pictures, it's phenomenal because some of them are 3 meters high by 2 meters wide. But they contain all this information that is, for most, would have been very secret. It's a kind of, we can get an indication here to try and unpick some of it. But it's symbolic spiritual language, which is used over and over in the 20th century in abstract work. But some of it goes right back to prehistoric times. Things like in this picture, the spiral is appearing there. We also got obvious symbols like the crosses and this circle. The color blue for her stood for the female spirit, the yellow for male spirit. She kept copious notes on what each of these kinds of symbols and marks and overlays meant. On one level, we can take it that she was influenced by a deep looking at nature, as we saw with the botanical picture, the structures of nature, how nature forms. But then there was also this teaching or this doctrine, how that information is then processed by our human minds and then structured to indicate how a life could be led, lived, or even, she believed, to forecast the future. There was there was something that went around that was quite common, the put about, that she said that these paintings that she would make would not be able to be understood in her day, and they couldn't be exhibited till 20 years or so after her death. As it happens, it was a long time after her death before they were exhibited as a whole, but during her life, there's evidence that she was trying to get them exhibited at different places, usually at spiritual gatherings. So we're unpicking some of the symbols that we got here in terms of, as you said, connecting with these ancient traditions, spiritual traditions. But she saw it as when the time was right, we would be able to understand more collectively this universal language. Now, this is an example of the scale and the size of them, called the 10 largest pictures. That was a series that a spirit guide had told her she'd be painting for the temple, inverted commas. Wasn't quite sure what the temple was, but it was basically an understanding or a body of knowledge, secret knowledge that could be unpicked. So the images almost look like these diagrams in places. Some of you might have done some bit of maths, some look like Venn diagrams where circles and things overlap each other. Or they're like cosmic paths. And she also includes some words as well, suggestions of words. Again, in the Arabic tradition and Hindu tradition, you can see in the Arabic tradition particularly, they use words a lot in their visual tradition. So these things were literally could be read by those people in the Theosophy Society. I'm just thinking of a famous theosophist like Steiner. Some of you might have heard of the Steiner schools. He went to see her work, and Rudolf Steiner, he did take away some information from the pictures that he saw when he went to visit her. But Rudolf Steiner said that he felt that they were just too secret, because they were coming from a place of a subjective spiritual source, and it would be difficult for people to read them. Saying that, he did take photographs of a number of them, and then later he met up with Mondrian. No, I think, or Kandinsky. I think it might have been Kandinsky. And they think that he showed Kandinsky these pictures. So there was, could have been a link into how Kandinsky developed his language as well. It's a universe. So basically what we're saying is a universal language is taking part here. When we look at these, we can see them as organic forms, and we can look at them and see like flower shapes and forms in the pieces. And we can indicate that they link to, as we said, mathematical kind of proportional diagrams. But the relationship between them is subjective, really, and it is subjective from a sense of time and place. none of us can take ourselves back 130 years or 120 years to truly get into the mind of how a theosophist was thinking in 1910 or something like that. But we can see how artists like Kandinsky and Mondrian and Malevich then developed these forms in their painting, which then had an influence on later abstract artists. And we can see how they were using the same kind of marks, the same kind of shapes. So in pictures like this, we can, on the scale that we just saw, we can see these symbols which are kind of talking a linking language. In this one, which you've got this symbol of the universe, the circle, serpent biting its tail as well, wrapping the world, sense of wisdom. You've got the symbol of the flower in the center, which then shrinks into a pink flower in a smaller area, and then it goes into this hexagonal shape. These symbols will come from yantras, which were visual diagrams from the Hindu tradition. So you're stepping into that. You're then combining it, with these symbols of triangles, triangles which point upwards and point downwards. Again, a triangle, symbols from the Hindu tradition. The triangle is a dynamic shape. It's a solid shape that can take us in different directions. When I mean different directions, I mean directions either up to the heavens or down to the earthly plane. Hilma af Klint, often in her pictures, works on opposites. So if she shows the symbol of things going up to the heavenly plane, they also go down to the earthly domain as well. You can also see things like the crescent moon shape appearing, heart shapes, all these shapes we sort of take for granted now, but they're deeply ingrained in cultural activity. When you place them all together and understand, what they're symbolizing, then they tell this story of how to unify your body and mind to be able to connect with higher levels of thinking. This is the ideology of it. It just becomes a bit tricky unless people have either studied theosophy quite deeply or are just coming at it from different traditions. But universal language is there. We're also seeing the use of black and white as well. So, we can read that in a symbolic way, days and nights and goods and bads and all that kind of thing. And we also could start to see the nature of the spirit world being suggested here. It's a kind of environment that your mind has to be really open to. Remember, just picture earlier, we saw a bit of automatic writing, so you can see how that sort of appeared in this final big painting. And I mentioned the crescent moon shape, which is appearing here, which is part of an Islamic tradition, of course. The moon, whether it and counterpointed with the sun or the symbol of the earth as a globe, again, opposites. So linking universality in our language appear over and over. Tree of knowledge, again, is another ancient symbol that artists had used for hundreds of years. And it's about building one set of knowledge on top of another set of knowledge. In this picture, like lovely little watercolor, you can see it's almost got a flavor as well, from our perspective, of something Celtic. Now, obviously, the Celts go back 3,000 years at least, something like that. And we can relate it to things like Celtic knotwork. That kind of, which you definitely see in the centerpiece there. And the Celtic nature, knotwork and relationship with nature, and in this case, the tree, is about combining universal language. We're seeing this channel and this path of universal language reaching up into the future there. At the bottom, for example, we see this heart shape, growth, universal, love, compassion, stretched out in two streams. She said the blue, symbol of the female for Hilma af Klint spirit, and the yellow, the symbol of the male spirit, intertwining and engaging in this spiritual developmental path as you go further and further and higher up into the top of the image, and things get more and more sensitive, more and more delicate. Spaces between shapes get finer and finer. Start off quite broad here, quite large. As we get further up, the perspective goes smaller and smaller, indicating the more delicacy of the development of a piece like this and the thought process. And the other thing you're seeing in this picture as well are these bird shapes. This is another one of her themes, the swan, which is a symbol for her of the divine spirit, the transcendental divine spirit. To see it here, she did a whole series of groups of these swans. I talked a little bit earlier about opposites, blacks and whites, symbols of light, dark, one thing mirroring the other thing. These kinds of things were all being talked about in not just the spiritual world, but the psychological world of the beginning of the 20th century as well. In the 1890s, 1910s, you got people like Carl Jung talking about these kinds of things and people's shadow states, etc. And trying to unify the two so that you can kind of get this ultimate balance in life and live a fulfilled, connected, wholesome life. The swan is a symbol of transcendental love because on the top of the lake, of course, it looks all serene, pure, but underneath, the little legs are going as fast as they can to kind of motivate and move this creature. So it's about making the effort, putting the effort in to be able to create a level of serenity in our lives. Doesn't just kind of happen. So these series of swans were painted in a way in this way initially, which is quite figurative, but then they start to get more and more abstract again. She's using mathematical kind of theorems here as well. She was interested in mathematics because everything is about structure and balance and understanding how patterns work in nature, which then things can be built on. And then you build them up in certain models to a state where they can be manifest into the physical world when you understand the patterns. And she's using them in the art because they do create things like movement, the dynamic, as we know from the triangle shapes that we got here. They also take us on journeys, as you can see from this arc that here. We've some of you know about things like the golden mean, which is a kind of archetypal balance in a painting. This is all to do with the mathematics of how our eye perceives the world. So this comes from deep study of nature and seeing how plants, minerals, anything on that kind of, that's got those very definite structures, snowflakes, for example, are so carefully constructed that we as human beings can then draw from them to use, in this case, in our paintings, in our artworks, to say what we we want to say about an invisible world. This is the thing, because she's inspired by the spiritual, it's invisible. And you either take it or you don't. Some people find it incredibly difficult to imagine that there's a universal spiritual order that's taking place that has got definite rules and structures that if you understand them, they can lead you in a certain way in your life. A lot of people most people need to know that they can believe what they see with their eyes. So if you go down this other direction, whereby she's saying she's been gifted with the insight of these spiritual masters that have come from these other earthly planes and put all this information in front of her, somehow it's got to be validated. Well, this is how the Western mind works. And it's one of the reasons why her work was not seen until more recent times. And it's interesting to see also how, in contrast to people like Mondrian or Kandinsky, theirs was accepted because their abstract work was coming out of what the eye could see. And then things were drawn from that. Hilma Klint and her colleagues was coming from what the mind and the spirit knew, which is much more difficult concept to get over to a larger audience. Anyway, as far as this picture is concerned, we've got the symbols of her swan wings, which are also influenced by these crescent moons. We've got this symbol of the snail, which is a snail shell, which is also a symbol of slow growth, deep learning. We got the heart at the center, which is about compassion, kindness, understanding, etc. And they're all drawn together. They're the focus in a dark world of ignorance and misunderstanding. Those are like some of the keys into understanding the symbols. This is another example of a swan. Yeah, as soon as you look at it, you think, yes, swan. But give her a moment, and then you think, okay, yes. So you've got the neck of the swan here. When you look at the swan's face, you see this curve. You see that touch of yellow on his beak and a touch of red underneath. She got the symbol for her, which is the spiritual symbol, in a unified form. So this is unified spiritual knowledge aware and floating in the symbolic red of the sacred. So because she's left all these notes in all her books, all these things can kind of be pieced together. And then, as I said, lots of artists from the 20th century use similar language because they're studying these ancient traditions and they're seeing these overlaps. Okay, this is another version of a swan. We got the swan this time with it's like a propeller in the center. It's almost like little wings that are flapping. It's very high frequency, but it's got delicate colors in it. Again, same colors we mentioned earlier, in a black and white background. When we switch into this way of thinking, the background could seem like water that's being churned up by the speed of the propeller moving through. It could almost be seen like a whole multitude of figures in the background. So you've got the mass of people or forms, and then you've got a specific singular form. That's the kind of contrast. And you've got one form floating above another form. And then just underneath on the lower part, you've got a separate form, which is like a crystal coming out at the bottom. So there's a link between this crystalline form and this propeller form. So this again, that engages with a sense of time. Crystals are ancient, they take a long time to form, etc. Whereas these wings of this propeller are moving incredibly quickly. It's fleeting. So something solid, something fleeting, etc. Opposites are taking place, particularly as you move into the 20th century. And there's another one of the swan where you see the symbol of the swan looks like a diamond. Above the top part above the lake, inverted commas, if you like, and the reflection underneath. So the pure form is above the lake, which is, moving towards the heavens and transcendental, or this spiritual light force of infinite knowledge and understanding. And below that, of course, deep in the lake, there is the darker side, the reflection, that needs to be kind of worked on, worked through, but it's always ever present in this process. Right? It's always this push-pull process taking place. Put those together so you can see the difference in the language more than anything else. Hilma Klint's language, as you said, is kind of curvilinear, rooted in, flower forms. And then Mondrian's, of course, was developed into something which was very related to squares, rectangles, etc. Where are we off here? There we go. But they're both developments of spiritual language. You see overlaps in colours there, but it's interesting how their language it looks to us on a certain level. You could say one's masculine and one's feminine. And it also talks about a particular period of time and understanding now as well, because now we've got both, and we've got both coming together in a harmony as well, starting to get much more balanced in our understanding of looking at Western art. As most predominantly up until the last 50 years or less, there was pretty much a male-centric version of Western art, but that now, fortunately, that's being redressed, particularly as we move into the 21st century. So we can see how the languages were operating side by side. That's why it's interesting to look at Klint and Pelton as well, because we can contrast it then to what else was happening in the visual art world, Western visual art world. So we mentioned the symbol of the swan. The other symbols that she liked to use over and over was the dove. Now, of course, the symbol of the dove, we see it as a symbol of peace. And these things are always favorable to people who looking towards the transcendental, always looking towards something which is beyond the here and now. We also see this dove form, these wings, and this energy which runs right through it, this spiral helix energy, which appears in science all the time, linking and creating this almost rainbow form underneath. When white light gets split by a prism, it takes on an array of colors. So in a sort of inconcise understanding of theosophy, that's what it is. It's about engaging with a whole host of different colors or different flavors of spiritual paths towards the unity of this one infinite light. Going through these planes of symbols of effort, work, which then takes you through to love, kindness, and understanding. The whole work is about that kind of path, whether she'd be making those large abstract pictures, the start of childhood and end of old age. We saw a couple of the bigger ones like the one of adulthood, and we'll see a couple in a minute. Or just a later works which tries to sum all this up. It's an example of her notebooks and studying these thoughts. I think those, if I remember correctly, the large paintings that she made, I think there was 173 of them. It's just a staggering number. So the energy that she had to produce those was, just a life force that came out of her, inspired by the practice, was immense. She was driven, if you like, to to say these things. And because she knew that it would be difficult for people to understand it, she backed them up with these notebooks that we're explaining now some of the imagery that is coming from and in them. We mentioned her reflections on Hinduism. Of course, this is a reflection on a Buddhist standpoint. And we also talked about dualities, light and dark. So this is kind of summed up quite nicely in a painting like this. It also looks like a head, doesn't it, or a figure? Of course you're saying, of course it does, Glyn. No, you see this sort of circular unity with maybe this line symbolizing the bottom of the nose and possibly a mouth of communicating there. It's pared back drastically, but there's definitely engagement on that kind of level with it. But on reflection, it's also something which is transcendental. It's something which is universal. It's something which we can read into big thinking, if you like. Well, these were part of her series that we looked at a bit earlier for the temple. And these are large paintings. I think I got another one show. There you go. That gives you an example of the size and the scale of them. But we can see how she's using universal iconography here. It's interesting, her name's Hilma Aft Klint. No relation to the Austrian painter, Klint. But he uses a lot of gold leaf in his pictures, as do a lot of the symbolists. This use of gold leaf and something which symbolizes the ultimate power source, which is the sun, and unity, radiating out into a dark universe. It is something which abstract painters then go on to repeat up to people like Rothko. If you've seen some of his large works, particularly his large-scale final works, he uses this deep burgundy and he uses these black pictures for his latest works. So she was ahead of her time with all this kind of use of these imagery. We also mentioned the triangle, which she used, but we see this triangle which is stepped in perspective. And like the tree of knowledge, we saw the same path. Something moving up into the distance. We get something which is just progressing. So there is a sense of effort and progression which takes place. We also see the possibility of ascending and in here descending as well. And that use of the spiral. So we're starting to just get familiar with this use of language now. So in your own paintings, if you find yourself making an abstract work, some of these shapes might just appear in your mind when you're making them. And you can then now think, well, I'm tapping into this abstract tradition. There's meaning in this. There's meaning that it's not just expressed in this visual tradition as Hilma Aft Klint is suggesting, but it goes back thousands of years as well. So there's depths to it, which might just encourage you to, include them into your abstract works in a mindful way as well. Your abstract work might start off as emotive feeling or a drawing from something you see in the physical world, but then you might be able to put into it something which is talking in this kind of language and from this kind of perspective. It also might be quite nice if you are one of these sensitive spiritual types that can kind of tap into these otherworldly feelings, to know that there is a universal language there that has been explored, and some of the things might make sense to you. We're all learning from each other all the time, and these things will come out in your paintings in interesting ways. This is said to have this ambition to make these large works is phenomenal. And in the end of her life, they were all gifted. Well, she gave them to her nephew because she couldn't get them exhibited, and then he looked after them, and then they were put into a trust fund, and then eventually, 20 years after her life, they were all shown in Sweden, and they petitioned for a part of the National Gallery to have a permanent collection of Hilma af Klint's work, and they were working towards trying to get a separate gallery as well. But if you go to Stockholm, there is a room dedicated to her work now. So she's a real established member of contemporary art in Sweden and universally as well. So that's a little overview of Hilma af Klint as we move on to Agnes Pelton. Now, Agnes Pelton, 1913, so there's overlaps. While Hilma af Klint was painting those large works that we've just looked at, Agnes Pelton is making paintings like this, where she's interested in the mystical and the mythical, symbolist works, again, of the spirit world. But she then quickly moves into, well, quickly, it's a developmental step into the abstract world. She was educated after she left Stuttgart. She lived for a very short time in the Netherlands and then went over to America. Her parents were both American, and she lived just outside New York and was sent to the Pratt School, which is again a traditional classical school of painting. But her father died when she was a teenager. Again, these sort of key people dying in these artists' early lives sometimes motivates them to get in touch with certain kind of spiritual dimension in their work. We see it as a pattern appearing. So, she then was surrounded by strong women. Her mum was a music teacher and ran a school in New York for most of her life, which again had an influence on Agnes Pelton's work, because music, as you know, is a very abstract art form. And then this led to her questioning the visual world that she found herself in. So she moves into this abstract world, as you can see here, as she gradually, geographically moves from the East Coast of America towards California and towards the desert as well. She believed that every place that you go to has spiritual resonance, cosmic spiritual resonance. These are sensitive people picking up these kinds of feelings. I think we all get them on some levels. We go to some places, don't we? And we feel at home there, or we feel slightly anxious there, or whatever. But I think if you take yourself to a place where there's not a lot of, what can we say, human activity, like in a desert, the silence of the land can speak to you more deeply. As she moved to in that direction, she was more and more interested in the native peoples of America, the Mojave people. And she painted constantly through her life a combination of pictures she could see with and recognize with her eyes, and pictures that she saw with her inner vision. You saw with Hilma af Klint, pictures that she saw just with her eyes were those early landscapes. Here, Agnes Pelton, to make ends meet, particularly when she moved to the desert, she painted a series of portraits first, then landscapes. She'd been trained in that particular way. But the real interest was in these abstract sensitivity works that were coming out again of her interest in theosophy, in her interest of the spiritual dimension of the world, and how that could be interpreted. So you end up with her creating these beautiful paintings like this. Very different style to Hilma af Klint, because her work are these highly finished oil pictures, paintings that are really smooth, almost glossy, with these wonderful, transcendental, subtle glazes of oil painting. And you can see in a picture like this, where you can read the night, of course, and the sunset. And at the bottom of the picture, you can read the hills and the mountains, warm, going off into the distance. You see the star, Venus, in the sky. And, oh, there she goes, long way. You see this organic form at the base, which has got a symbol, male and female symbols united in it. So she's using common iconography, common symbols again to Hilma Klint. She's just treating it in a very different way. Spatial perspective is much more of a priority in this case, in this work here. Let's see if my machine will then take me to the next one. Will it? Yes, there we go. So this piece, the voice, is linked to her interest in what we call, or what she was interested in, was called Agni Yoga. Yoga, again, Hindu tradition, is all about union, okay? Union with the spirit. The fire is a cleansing union. I suppose because she was drawn to the desert, the heat, and she saw the power of nature in those circumstances, fire played a particularly prominent part of being able to cleanse oneself, literally, of defilements, physical, mental, physical, all those sorts of things, and be able to see clearly. Now, the Native American Indians used these fire pits and fire centers that they would go into to meditate, cleanse themselves. They're like a sauna, really, having that much heat. So all the dirty bits can come out of you, if you like. And what she uses this in her artwork as a symbol of cleansing, as a symbol of being able to get to the light beyond the dark. The images, once you've seen them, they're so, as I said, so subtle, so iconic that they're difficult to forget. But this is a very concise image of how a fire would kind of radiate with its heat below, then the Earth's surface cooling it, and then as it kind of expands, exploring and expanding out into the universe. But it also gives a reflection of almost like a plant as well. So she did study all the vegetation in the desert, and that had a large influence on her work as well. These sense of beautiful images that she created with symbols of the universe and these urns or receptacles of the spirit appears over and over in a picture. She's suggesting that the spirit is incredibly delicate and subtle, like wisps of smoke that can't really, it's not that tangible. But when you tune to it, it then can be filled. Yourself can be filled, your container can be filled with it. And then you can transcend your time and space. The symbols being used here are the cosmos, again, these stars, the big thinking. While she's out in the desert, of course, with no light pollution, etc., the stars and reading the stars and being able to be guided by the stars and the importance of the stars becomes much more prevalent than we have the opportunity to experience in our day-to-day lives. And we know that astronomy and astrology has been studied through the ages as well. So all those things feed into one's understanding. And then she places this receiving container, if you like, on this mound, which could symbolize, of course, mound in the desert, in the dark, or nature, floating above a kind of universal sea, which again is something which is incredibly vast. This is all kind of the symbols that appear over and over. This one, this sandstorm, she's combined the elements that we described about when you look at the sun, you get this starburst effect. It's mute starburst effect, but in a storm, you get this combination. When a storm takes place, we've had them today all over the place. You get these rainbows, light going through these particles turns into the multicolors of many understandings in this case. Hilma Klint used it in her swans. Here she's using it as a symbol in the desert, as the sun, to transform and create growth, to create nature. Even in the harshest of place, these plants kind of grow. Light against dark, the balance of the universal cosmos in this way. Now, Agnes Pelton was also interested in seances and connecting with this spiritual world. And she had a number of spiritual guides as well. This was a painting of one of her spiritual guides as she saw her that would tell her what to paint and how to paint, or indicate it to her. These are very real for these artists. The thing is with art at times, particularly people like Agnes Pelton who like to spend a lot of time on her own and would go out into the desert, the mind has to fill a particular space or void with information. And she's creating this other world or this other world connection. So, just as maybe young people in pre-formed state have imaginary friends, you could say that a highly developed spiritual being takes an element of that into adulthood and can then use it to be able to create imagery or whatever, scientific inventions, anything, all these sorts of things. If you look at it through the lens of these two particular artists, you can also understand how it's difficult for people to accept some of the things that they're portraying and sharing as well. Both these artists are highly intuitive artists as well. That's another quality that comes through in it. And intuition is also a very difficult thing to really pin down, as is our soul or our spirit, It's a presence, it's there somewhere in the quiet moments, but it's not something that really can be shown or spoken about or ever in any definite forms. You can only hint at it. And that's what these artists are doing. They're hinting at those things. But she creates these beautiful glowing paintings that have these iconic forms in it. We saw the swan is appearing here. We got this pyramid shape. Around about this time, there was a great interest in the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, which was in the early 1920s, which took you straight back to an ancient era and time again. But of course, it had the symbol of the triangle as this universal force as well of power, pointing to this guiding star. This is iconography that we've seen over and over now. These golden flowers, symbol of something of real beauty coming out of maybe something that's quite dark and sparse. And this ruby red river, this is a symbol of spiritual life force running past. All these kinds of things coalesce into these pictures. The feminine force, or the female feminine force, was something which she, as well as had as a spiritual guide, she tried to portray over a number of times as well. We reflect on the idea of Mother Earth, of course. In this case, it's mother of contemplation, deep contemplation, to get in touch with something which is rich, traditionally tied into the red notion of kindness, care, and compassion for the mother of silence, or the mother earth, but a balance between the spiritual dimension of the blue. We see this figure, or this almost like Buddha shape, emerging out of the center, head, shoulder, sat in the center there, and the forces rotating and running around her are just sensitive directional forces of understanding. There's also, because of the softness, it's got a hint at a kind of flower shapes as well. And some of these pictures, there's connections with people like Georgia O'Keeffe, made those emblematic and symbolic close-ups of flowers in the desert. Both artists spend time in the desert, suggesting a universal language again. In this case, this is a later one now, being able to get in touch with the past or the future in these cases through this deep meditation. Here, hint at a memory of her father, or the universal father, potentially coming from another space, time, place, always present, always with us in this desert space that can be filled with the symbols of Mother Earth, kindness, compassion, understanding, and light. These things are themes which she just revisits time again. This is interesting. These are later works now. She's developed this language, these symbols, these icons that we've seen now, and their all aim is to liberate oneself. Liberate oneself from what? Well, the key is to try and encourage our beings to be happy more times than they're not, to overcome a sense of suffering, to be able to, on more occasions than not, go in a direction of the light, the peace, the kindness, all those kinds of things, and hoping or indicating that art can suggest this. It's like a blind faith. You have to have a faith, a belief that it can. And these artists, one was working in Sweden, one was working in America, a slight overlap in times, but they're using universal languages to speak of these same things. So maybe there is this universal language that is ever present, that if we can tune into, it could bring us in this kind of direction. As us creating our pieces, if we're using, again, these symbols, we'll be offering that to our audience as well. So we can read this, of course, it says ascent or liberation to the light. It's this subtle, flowing, ethereal thing that, again, has got this diamond shape, or with this triangular top going upwards. You feel as if something is moving upwards. And it's just a slight indication of, the desert dunes in the background as you move forward from emptiness to something universal. Again, coming out of a tradition of Buddhist tradition, but we're seeing this definitely a universal tradition, because she's a German American artist, also connecting with these things as well. This is one of her more naturalistic paintings that she painted alongside these abstract works, because these would sell a bit more than the abstract works. Abstract works, when you're dealing with spiritual matters, got a very small audience. But you can believe me, because it's a strange language, and it's a small number of people maybe that pick it, can understand it, unless they've been unlocked to it, like we've tonight unlocked some of the universal symbols that are being used in these paintings. But you can see she makes these beautiful pictures of trees and the fauna of the desert as well. There's another one, yeah. These were sacred trees to the native people. They give an idea of the landscape as well. We see this beautiful, delicate way she paints these works, and then they feed into her abstract work. I think this is the last picture, if you're still awake. She's moved right through all this understandings now to the center, which is the light. And this is one of her last pictures. We have the symbol of the blue, which is this transcendent spiritual form. We do have a sense of perspective and landscape in her pictures, even these later ones. At the base, as we said, it looks like sand dunes or something like that. And then we're moving up to this very delicate, ethereal, almost smoky, like subtle images through this light doorway to something which is suggested as going onward and beyond into space.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell notification.